Among many people who have passed away the last period of time, you may or may not have heard of the name of Lion Gardner Tyler Jr. He was a historian. He died at the age of 95, the ripe old age of 95. He is famous not only for being a historian, but also for being the grandson of the 10th president of the United States. His grandfather, John Tyler, was born in 1790 and became the 10th president of the United States when he was sworn in as the running mate of President William Harrison, who died of pneumonia shortly after being sworn into office. And so John Tyler became the 10th president. His son, Lion Gardner Tyler Sr., born in 1853, recalled seeing the Civil War. And now his son, born in 1925, each of these children born in their father's old age, relatively speaking, Lion Gardner Tyler Jr. passed away just now in September at the age of 95. I'm thinking about this little vignette about 3 generations spanning so much history, because when we open Parshat Toldot, we realize that it's a Parsha whose name is generations. And the idea that this Parsha, Rabbi Moshe Wolfson points out, contains within it the only time that all 3 Avot are alive at the same time and likely interacted. And strangely, we have no record of what type of interaction they had. Indeed, Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holid et Yitzchak. And then further along, V'achrechen yatsa achiv yado chezet ba'akev Esav, v'yikra shmo Yaakov, Yitzchak ben shishim shna beledet otam. We have 2 other psukim, one about the boys growing up, and the other about the love of the parents for their children. And then Yaakov is making the soup. Rashi, quoting from the Medrash, tells us this is about the soup that was for the Sudat Havra of Yitzchak Avinu after his father Avram Avinu having just passed away. The Ktav Sofer notes that it is a feature typically of the 3 Avot that they are generally listed as Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and yet there's a notable exception in Sefer Vayikra, V'zacharti et Briti Yaakov, V'afer Briti Yitzchak, V'afer Briti Avraham Eskor, V'aretz Eskor. And the idea that the remembrance of the covenant with Yaakov, Yitzchak, Avraham is in reverse order. Notes the Ktav Sofer that actually we know that every child can bring merit to their parents in this world and even after the parents have left the world. Bra Mizake Abba, the Talmud teaches, and we can bring merit to previous generations. But that's on a certain level obvious. A child is the extension genetically of their parents. The real chidush, says the Ktav Sofer, is the opposite, that there could be a zchut avot, the merit of the parents, could stand in the place for the children. That itself is a chesed. What has the child done? What portion do they have to merit getting that which their parents have already accomplished as some kind of an intergenerational merit for them? V'zeh michazdei Hashem, shenotzar chesed lo'avav me'avot lebanim. The great idea here of the kindness of Hashem, that the linkage is not just that a child feels, I inherited from my parents, but that parents and grandparents should be able to feel they are bestowing merit on future generations through their actions. Now, this is not just true in families. I believe it's true in shuls as well. And at risk of patting not just ourselves, a congregation or Torah, but community shuls around the world like it on the back, one of the great advantages, which I sorely miss now, I think all of us miss, because so many members of our shul are not in shul on a weekly or daily basis now, is the reality that, God willing, when COVID will end, and COVID will end, we'll be back in shul, and that our shul will celebrate once again the reality that we are a multi-generational congregation, that actually we are priming ourselves for a work, an activity that is not just the engagement with tefillah and Talmud Torah, but of an intergenerational communication that moves in 2 directions. Not just that younger generations should feel we inherited this from the parents and grandparents, but the parents and grandparents should feel we have a certain merit that we bestow on future generations. I think it's not just true in a biological sense. I think it's true also in an ideational sense within a congregation. Indeed, as Rashi writes on that pasuk from Sefer Vayikra, where it's in reverse order, I'll remember my covenant with Yaakov and with Yitzchak and with Avraham. Rashi writes, why are they backwards? Lomar kedaihu Yaakov akatan lekach. Because on a certain level, Yaakov has to stand on his own 2 feet. Vim eino kedai, but if he's not worthy, harei Yitzchak imo. Then he can rest on the idea that he has a previous generation called Yitzchak. Vim eino kedai, and if he's not worthy enough, harei Avraham imo, shehu kedai. And therefore it goes in a backwards order. In our Parsha, we see the story of continuity, but also, unfortunately, about the rupture of continuity and some very trying circumstances and difficulties within the family dynamic that threaten to rupture everyone. Consider that Rivka Imenu, when she's pregnant, she is very concerned about her pregnancy. Rabbi Menachem B. Sachs from our community here in Chicago, Zichron Livracha's Menachem Tzion, notes the very simple point that Rivka Imenu, when she's pregnant, does not know she's having twins. And the angst is, as the Medrash describes, when she passes a house of Torah study, the baby is kicking to get out. But then when she passes a house that is filled with idolatry, the baby is kicking to get out. And she asks herself, how could this be? I'm going to have a child that is going to be so torn between 2 ways of being that they will actually always live with a desire to run in both directions at the same time? How will a person be able to be an integrated personality if they're always so torn between 2 polarities, 2 extremes? Now, unfortunately, we know what happened in the end to Esav. But Yitzchak believed in his son, and he tried his utmost to keep his son on the path. He saw something in his son, Esav, that was actually a feature of himself as well. And that was the midah, the attribute of din, of justice, or of gvura, of mightiness. Esav played this out as a great hunter. Yitzchak was always trying to figure out, how can I integrate him into the family structure, find something for him? And unfortunately, of course, it does not work out. But for a man, Yitzchak, who had seen both heaven and hell in his own life, in fact, in our own Parsha, his greatness was in being able to integrate the polarities and hold them together. When the Torah describes that the eyes of Yaakov were dimmed, of Yitzchak rather, were dimmed, his eyes had dimmed and he had become old, aged, and he could no longer see. Rashi writes, one of the interpretations, as we all know, is he was bound up on the altar. His father was going to slaughter him. The heavens opened. The tears of the angels went into his eyes. Such visions of greatness did he see, such moments that were both exalted but also terrifying that he experienced, that he was unable to see the world through other eyes anymore. He lived in a certain way, in an otherworldly fashion. And at the very moment when suddenly and very harshly he recognizes that his son Esav is that boy who was pining to get out in utero for the wrong things, the Torah describes Ve'echarad Yitzchak charad gedola ad me'od. And here Rashi comments from the world of the Medrash, Ra'a Gehenim Petucha mitachtav. He saw the yawning abyss of the netherworld, of the Gehenim, opening up under his son Esav. And he realized that the dream, unfortunately, that he had for his son Esav was not to be. Yet if you keep reading in the Parsha, he still gives Esav a bracha, still trying to find a way for him to be part of the family. It's a real challenge to try to make that integration happen. But we recognize an early sign that perhaps was an indication that Esav was already early on in a way that was unhealthy. It had to do with his relationship to his own grandfather. You see, when Avram Avinu died, Esav and Yaakov have a brief but very harsh conversation. Amar lo mativo shel nazid, why are you making the soup? Asked Esav, coming barreling into the house, exhausted, as the Torah describes. Amar lo shemet oto zaken, because that elder has passed away. Amar answered Esav, Ba'oto hazakin pagam midat hadin? Do you mean to tell me that the attribute of justice has stricken out against this old man? Amar Lohin, he said, yes. Amar im kain lo matan schar lo tchiat hametim. If that can happen, then actually there can't be any reward and there can't be any resuscitation of the dead. And at that moment, the Ruach HaKodesh started screaming this idea of the screaming of the Ruach HaKodesh, because actually Esav at this moment had committed an act of heresy. I think it's not just theological, though. It's the idea that Esav was so vested in the identity of his grandfather as this great figure, but also a figure who lived outside of the realm of vulnerability. And Esav, who is locked into a way of being and thinking that is exclusively about the midat hadin, the attribute of justice, which he inherited from his father. But his father had this ability to hold it as an inward power. For Esav, it kept breaking out with fury, with anger, with a murderous tendency. And therefore, he retrojects his own inability to manage within himself, and he puts it back on the death of his Zayda, as it were, the Zaken, as a reason to no longer hew to any sense of tradition and Masorah. He wants his bracha after he gets his soup. He changed his mind. He doesn't want the bracha, doesn't want the bracha, doesn't care. Eat, drink, tomorrow we die. But later in the Parsha, now suddenly he wants it again. Why? Because it become a commodity. And why? Din said that actually by rights, he was somehow deserving of it by some calculus that he had, since he was, after all, biologically born first. I think we learn here some important lessons, some cautionary tales as well. First, the hopeful message about the intergenerational linkage and communication that transpires within a family, but also potentially within a community. The Gemara Bava Metzia relays that if you have 3 generations successively that are actually engaged in the world of Torah, so then we have fulfillment of the pasuk that many of us read every day, Nuval Tzion, Liamush mipicha mipi zaracha mipi zera zaracha, Mar Hashem me'atav ad olam. The Torah will not depart from your mouth, from the mouth of your progeny, and from the grandchildren progeny, that level, the 3rd generation, from now and for all time. It's a challenge. But we take from this an idea that this is the Parsha of generations. We also learn the cautionary tale of what happens when an individual inherits some of the powers and abilities of a previous generation, but sadly is unable to channel them in a productive manner, and instead it leads to rage and ruin. Even a father who was unable to sense exactly what was going on, and his disguised son came into the room, had some kind of a chush. He could smell that there was something about this boy that was special. Vayigash vayishaklo vayarachet rech begadav vayavarechehu. He could smell the smell on his clothing, and he gave him a bracha. And listen to the words, because there's an admixture of senses. Vayomer, and he declared, Re'ei reach b'ni kereach sadeh asher beracho Hashem. See the scent, my son, which is the scent of the field which God has blessed. Rashi, Melamed shenichnas imo ruach gan Eden. Coming in with Yaakov was somehow the spirit, the aroma of a Gan Eden. What does that mean? That even denied his ability to see things in this world, Yitzchak at this point sees only the heavens above, and he can see the Gehenna below, but he knows that there is something that mediates between those two, and that is having a next generation that remains faithful to a tradition. And just by dint of having him come in the room, there's that sense that there will be a certain continuity there. There's more to say, but I don't want to expand the drasha beyond 15 minutes, so I'll stop here with these musings. But just to consider that at the moment, we are engaged in a great trial as a community, because we're in a shul where there are no young children, because older members of our congregation, by and large, are not comfortable coming to the shul. But I want to underscore the message again and again to reinforce it. The bracha of congregation or Torah and shuls like it is davka that we are intergenerational and multi-generational. Intergenerational in terms of the messages that we seek to convey, and from one generation to the next, and multi-generational because precisely in the snapshot of the old hand, the old wrinkled hand, and the young fingers holding each other, we have a community shul. And God willing soon, Berovam Hadrat Melech, will be zocha to be back together again. I wish everyone Shabbat Shalom for Parshat Toldot, the Parsha of linking generations. Shabbat Shalom.